Hello, everyone. My name is Jack, and this is part one of a five-part series teaching the European Strategic Autonomy DA. I advise that you take notes because I think they'll be helpful, and not all of the content will be on the slides. The five parts of the series proceed as the history of strategic autonomy, perspectives on strategic autonomy, the parts of the DA, debating the DA, and answering the DA. Today is the first part of this lecture series, and we'll be going over four different things. First, what is strategic autonomy? Second, a glossary of useful terms. Third, the history of strategic autonomy. And fourth, how the Ukraine war implicates strategic autonomy. I think we should start with this image because it frames the fundamental debate. The US is responsible for a disproportionate share of NATO's defense, and countries are questioning whether that is a good or bad thing. People that think that the US should have a smaller share in European defense are pro-strategic autonomy, and people that think that the US should have a larger share in European defense are anti-strategic autonomy. And as can be seen in this image, the US does take up a large part of NATO defense spending currently. So then that begs the question, what is strategic autonomy? In general, strategic autonomy refers to the EU's ability to chart its course in line with its interests and values. Specifically, much of the debate has focused on separating EU and NATO military and defense spending away from the US and towards a larger role for European nations. In essence, it means decreased reliance on the United States. What makes up strategic autonomy is intentionally vague. The purpose of this is to garner as much support as possible for the idea without causing anger. However, ambiguity has been unhelpful for strategic autonomy as it has drawn criticism from the United States. Even more importantly, this vagueness has led to confusion within the European Union because a lack of clarity has decreased member states' willingness to contribute individual policies to the initiative. It should be evident, though, that what autonomy does not necessarily entail is independence, less still unilateralism. In fact, insofar as multilateralism is a defining feature of the EU's internal constitution, which we'll talk about later, the EU will always be inclined to act in a multilateral way and cooperate with core partners such as the United Nations, the US, and NATO, as well as other regional organizations. Essentially, an EU strategic autonomy posture necessarily has multilateralism as one of its fundamental goals. Another important question to ask is whether or not strategic autonomy is actually needed. Most countries talk about strategic autonomy for the purpose of deterring Russia and other regional threats, but European countries and NATO spent around $280 billion in 2019, which is more than four times Russia's spending, which proves that EU does have a larger defense budget than Russia does. So then some may wonder why strategic autonomy actually is needed in the first place. Now we're going to talk about a few important terms that will be useful for the rest of the lecture series. The first one is the European Union, which is a political and economic union of 27 member states that are located primarily in Europe. Second is NATO, which is an intergovernmental military alliance between 30 member states, 28 of which are European states, and 2 of which are North American states. The founding principle of NATO is that it connects the European allies to the wider US security umbrella, including both nuclear and conventional forces, and the promise of massive reinforcement from the US if needed. Next is NATO Article 5, which is part of the NATO Constitution. This states that an attack on one member of NATO is an attack against all the NATO members, and thus, in that case, all the NATO members will agree to defend one another. The only time this has ever been activated in history was after 9/11. Next is Brexit, which is the withdrawal of the United Kingdom from the European Union in 2020. Next is multilateralism, which refers to an alliance of multiple countries pursuing a common goal. Example, international climate regimes like the Paris Climate Accords are a form of multilateral solutions to climate change. Next is the EU's global strategy, which was a report published in 2016 that provides directives for long-term EU goals, one of those being strategic autonomy. Next is the Common Security and Defense Policy, which is a document that provides the EU with the capacity to undertake peacekeeping and conflict prevention missions and to strengthen international security in accordance with the principles of the UN Charter. Next is the Permanent Structured Cooperation, which is PESCO, which is the part of the European Union's security and defense policy in which 25 out of the 27 national armed forces pursue structural integration of military capabilities. Next is the European Defense Fund, which is the component of the European Union's common security and defense policy, which aims to coordinate and increase national investment in defense research. Now let's talk about the history of strategic autonomy before the Ukraine war. European unions have relied on the security umbrella provided by NATO since the end of World War II. American troops are scattered around dozens of bases in Europe. and in 2022, the number of American soldiers in Europe is estimated to be around 100,000, a figure more significant than the active military forces of 20 of the 27 EU members. European strategic autonomy was first used by the December 2013 Foreign Affairs Council of the European Union in reference to security and defense. While not explicitly defined, it was elevated as a broader strategic ambition in the 2016 EU Global Strategy, agreed immediately after the Brexit referendum, but when the Union still included 28 member states. A few months later, a loose definition was provided in the Implementation Plan on Security and Defense, in which defines strategic economy as the EU's ability to act in security and defense together with partners when it can, alone when it must. The next important piece of history in strategic economy is the Strategic Compass. This document sets out member states' commitments to specific priority actions in 4 areas. First, rapid and robust action whenever a crisis erupts. Second, with partners if possible and alone when necessary. Third, securing access to strategic domains by boosting the EU's intelligence capabilities and creating the EU. And fourth, creating the EU hybrid toolbox. However, many EU states think that this was a deployment. It does not lay out the fundamental necessities required for long-term policy strategic autonomy. As things stand, strategic autonomy also looks limited by low defense spending. The UK, Greece, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and the 3 Baltic states are the only European NATO members to meet the organization's 2% of GDP defense spending target. France, a leader of the strategic autonomy movement, figures 1.84% in 2019. Germany was 1.36%, with an addition of less than 0.2% of GDP for 2015, when its military was so under-resourced that it used broomsticks in place of guns during a NATO training exercise. Those statistics show that Europe is probably not on track for strategic autonomy currently, based solely on defense spending and percent of defense spending that comes from GDP, but we'll talk about that more later. However, EU defense spending has been increasing since 2014, and we'll also talk about the reason for this more later, but it's primarily due to A, US unreliability with the Trump and Biden administrations, and B, fears of Russia and China. However, a lot of these things have changed since the start of the Ukraine war, with European nations announcing that they're going to spend more on defense spending. For example, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz announced that his government would increase defense spending to 2% of GDP. Poland, which is on the border of Ukraine, announced that its defense budget would jump to 3% of GDP, which is a 205% spike of what it currently is. Italy unveiled plans to, quote, invest more in defense than we have ever done before, quote, end quote. Norway, which shares land and maritime borders with Russia, is making immediate emergency investments to increase the number and tempo of naval deployments, increase the number of combat exercises, increase ammunition and fuel stocks, enhance its ability to receive allied reinforcements, and strengthen the armed forces' ability to prevent and stop digital threats. All those examples prove that currently the Ukraine war is increasing European countries' desire to invest in their own defense capabilities, which shows that in some ways, the Ukraine war is helping the progress towards strategic autonomy. However, it is also hurting the progress towards strategic autonomy because it's requiring increased U.S. security cooperation and increased U.S. military presence in the region, both of which things that countries like France and Italy say are explicitly against the goals of strategic autonomy because they trade off with European nations developing their own indigenous defense capabilities. So we will have to see whether or not post-Ukraine war, Europe is closer or further away from strategic autonomy.